Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you to Melanie and the UN Correspondents Association for hosting us today. My name is Jamie Grant. I work with the International Disability Alliance. We represent persons with disabilities within the UN major groups and other stakeholders for sustainable development. Today, I'm coordinating on behalf of all the major groups and other stakeholders to help us engage with the press. So each of these groups, we all facilitate the participation of people around the world in the UN's post-2015 agenda for sustainable development goals. These include members of civil society and NGOs, local government, development and human rights organizations, scientists, workers and trade unions, children and young people, indigenous peoples, farmers, women, persons with disabilities, educational and academic entities, older persons, philanthropists, and many, many more. It's a fluid structure, but with official recognition within the UN system, both in feeding into the creation of the SDGs and in the overview review process. Each of these groups is directly affected by the negotiations that are being finalized this week. From the ground up, these groups and stakeholders each constitute a global network of member-based organizations of concerned citizens. We have brought together people from across the world and made sure that they were listened to at the negotiating table. Together, we have enabled more public involvement in the creation of this agenda than in any other international process in history. So representatives from these groups and stakeholders are all here today to reinvigorate the public conversation and build long-term dialogues, which we hope will enrich and calcify the accountability and review mechanisms that are going to be built into the post-2015 agenda. So everyone here today has a critical role to play in this. We have three main speakers who are going to be speaking on behalf of major groups and other stakeholders broadly. We have shared interests across major groups and other stakeholders, and they're going to be our main panelists here today. But we also have present representatives from specific major groups and other stakeholders in the room today who can take specific questions related to their constituencies and issues they've been facing this week and over the last 5 years, and what they're looking forward to over the next 15 years of implementation. So they'll be able to speak specifically on behalf of their group stakeholder constituency. Our first speaker is beside me, Bisani Sibidini, from Save Metabellum Zimbabwe, and also the post-2015, the Beyond 2015 Coalition campaign. So, Bisani.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bisani Sibidini from Save Metabellum Coalition, and I'm also the National Coordinator for Beyond 2015 Zimbabwe. I'll be giving a few notes on poverty and inequality in relation to the current discussions. Poverty and inequalities remain the foundational constructs and architecture of all social ills, including marginalization, discrimination, and of course, climate change, human rights, and all other related problems. For member states to actually have a transformative agenda, there is a need for a transition, and there's a need for them to address the real issues that are poverty and inequalities, and especially for the inclusion and the involvement of those in vulnerable situations to participate. From the onset, beyond 2015 has been pushing for the participation of people living in poverty and vulnerable situations and those being affected by inequalities, most at the national and the global level. We are also advocating for the redistribution of wealth, for the inclusion of ways to mitigate against unsustainable production and consumption patterns, and also for tackling illicit financial flows. Ultimately, participation of those affected by poverty and inequality remains critical in the implementation of the agenda. And only talking about this agenda and leaving them behind at the national and global participation is retrogressive. I think basically these are the key elements that we want to make sure that they remain towards the end of the negotiations. And also, people should be given the ability to participate even in follow-up and review mechanisms, which still remains weak to date as we close the negotiations. I think for now, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Our second speaker is Noeline Nabadibu from Diverse Voices and Action for Equality in Fiji, and also Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era.
Thank you. So I've been asked to just speak very briefly to a very broad issue, which is protecting our planet, nature, and stopping climate change. So as you can imagine, that's about a lot. For us, what we've been saying throughout the civil society is that climate change changes everything, and that it is about systemic change. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as we've been saying, are an important step in the right direction. We need a world that is free of fossil fuel emissions, and it's been really good to see some of that text developing. But what we really are calling for is a phase out now, as soon as we can, of fossil fuels and moving towards safe and renewable forms of energy. We also need, what we've been saying all along is that this is about the decisive action by states and on states as duty bearers. So what we're saying is that for climate change to be effective, we have to work on mitigation, on the targets of mitigation, and that is about this agreement, but it's also about all the other international agreements, and it's about COP21, which is coming up in December in France. It's also about adaptation, and for us that requires that you need to be speaking about psychosocial adaptation, about infrastructural adaptation, but that you have to be speaking also about disaster and risk reduction, about resilience and recovery, because it's about people who are already dealing right now with loss and damage across the world. It's also about issues such as migration, the movements of people, and much more. We need a specific attention, as we've been saying throughout the process, to ocean acidification, but to also the state of all our ecosystems, including oceans, lakes, rivers, desertification. It's about forests and deforestation and stopping that now, not in some future imagined date, but we need to start that now. And in alignment with international agreements, which for us is the IEG targets. It's also about the quality of our water and our air, and that includes the human right to water. And we need to be seeing this across all of our international agreements, but also whenever we're speaking about human rights or development, we need to be talking about climate resilient development and climate justice. So the science, we think, is clear. So this is now about political will and about implementation plans, because the post-2015 development agenda needs to be about all the different kinds of people in the world and their access to full and meaningful lives. We have to hold the increase in global average temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We've been very clear, and we can see that language coming through, and it needs to be strong. Moving into COP 21, because everyone has a right to survive and thrive, and that includes small island and developing states. We need a phasing out of both fossil fuel but ending subsidies. We need a conservation and sustainable use of all of the ecosystems. We have to focus, therefore, on economic systems. So it's about sustainable production, consumption, and distribution, as we've seen already in the text. And we'd like that strengthened even more. We have to address, and this is something that civil society works on very much, but it's about addressing the existing inequalities within states as well as between states. For us who are women human rights defenders, for instance, this is also about gender equalities and about addressing issues such as SRHR, but it's also about the regulation of corporations and changing unfair trade, aid, and development systems, and of course it's about financing for development in its fullest sense. So to conclude with, human rights commitments have to form the basis for the post-2015 development agenda. We say that this development agenda must be about and by and for all people with no exceptions. Ultimately, human well-being depends on ecosystem well-being and staying within our planetary boundaries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rafi. And our third speaker, the final speaker from the panel, is Savio Cavallo from Amnesty International.
Thank you. I want to start by quoting Nelson Mandela, who actually said in 1990 that the collapse of good conscience and the absence of accountability and public scrutiny have led to crimes against humanity and violations of international law. Why am I quoting? Including overarching reference to human rights, gender equality, leaving the one behind, and recognition of the agenda, which is to be people-centered. There are also improvements with regards to the overall expression of ambition, urgency, participation, and references to specific groups like migrants and indigenous people. Having said that, there are three main concerns that we would sort of like to bring to this audience. First one is on the universality of the agenda itself. We are concerned that the references in several places to national sovereignty, circumstances, and priorities compared to the last draft has increased. So the previous draft we have seen about 4 references, now we have seen 6 references. These multiple references risk undermining the universality of the agenda and hence the implementation of all the SDGs in all the countries in conformity with human rights, including progressive realization. And this sort of, in a sense, fits within CBDR, the whole argument around progressive realization. We recognize that implementation will always have to be led in a national context. However, we also call for references to national sovereignty and similar caveats to be reduced or deleted. So you sort of bring the universality of the agenda to the surface. The second concern that we have is accountability. You know, there's also fear even to use this word nowadays, so it's called follow-up and review. We would like to remind member states that follow-up and review is an integral part of an effective, empowering, and inclusive 2015 agenda and must not be treated as an add-on or something that you can sort of buy off the shelf. It will be impossible to achieve a truly transformative, substantive development agenda to leave no one behind without conducting regular, transparent, holistic, and participatory reviews of progress and setbacks at all levels. And this is where the learnings come in. This is a chance for states to show their intention to put in place robust and participatory monitoring mechanisms and conduct regular reviews. And we feel that every 2 or 3 years, every single country can actually have a review. It's possible within the time frame. And of course, every national processes will be different, but inclusivity, transparency, participation, and human rights should be a baseline for all. And all states should have formal and accessible channel for people and civil society, including national human rights institutions, to freely participate and contribute their own reports and assessments. And here I want to highlight their own reports. And finally, the third major concern is the culture of universal participation, which it does not exist. Although the high-level political forum reviews voluntary participation by all UN member states should be expected and incentivized. This requires that all states prioritize reporting at the global level and participate constructively, building on strong national review processes. Incentives for participation might include financial incentives, capacity building, and technical support. We want member states to step forward and volunteer themselves to be reviewed, thereby proactively setting an example and their own commitment for an effective implementation of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Zolia. Okay, now I do want to open up to the room questions, but we were thinking that we have so much expertise in the room. We've been part of these negotiations, not just this week, not just the past 2 years, but some back 20 years they've been involved in major groups of the stakeholders. So there's some excellent resources here around this. So I actually wanted to introduce 3 particular representatives from 3 major groups to give a very brief introduction to the work that major groups are doing. And then we'll open up properly to questions from everyone, which can be directed to any particular constituency. So we're thinking it's more of a round table and just a panel of questions. So first, I wanted to call on Saida Ali from the Women's Major Group. She's. Will you pass the mic? Yes.
Thank you. I'm feeling like I should come to the front maybe, but I need to keep my computer charged. So, thanks. So I will speak as I walk to the front. My name is Saida Ali. I work with the International Women's Health Coalition, and we are one of the organizing partners of the Women's Major Group. And some of you may know that the Women's Major Group actually has over 600 individual and organizational members that are drawn from diverse groups in different regions. And over time, and since the beginning of this process, the Women's Major Group has engaged women in always highlighting what the key priorities are for women. And so you may know or may not know that we've been associated with the famous red flags, that we always draw attention to what our red flags have been at whatever level or at whatever stage of the process. And just in case you're wondering why those of us in the room have the blue scarves, it's because today is a day that we are highlighting the issue of women, peace and security, because over this period, this particular period of the intergovernmental negotiations, we've had a color campaign that has highlighted key issues or key concerns, some of which have actually been touched on by my colleague Nolene, around climate justice. So as a woman who comes from Kenya, a country that has a number of issues that have affected women and girls, specifically touching on peace and security, I feel compelled to just mention that sometimes some of the practices that are discriminatory, some of the structural inequalities that put women and girls in situations of poverty may not be defined as the usual peace and security issues, but they are in fact security issues for women and girls. When someone is not at peace because their daughter died from female genital mutilation, or because they could not go to school because of one reason or the other around not being able to afford, or because of health factors that they may not be able to access health due to affordability, all of those we highlight as key issues that may not be defined as the usual peace and security issues, but they are in fact issues that cause a lot of disturbance at a personal level. So I just want to use this few minutes to highlight quickly some key priorities that we have and that we are talking about, and we'll open it to questions so that even some of my colleagues there can respond to. First, and to highlight, and Sabio has already mentioned, that we are happy on gender equality, that we are pleased that the draft as it is now actually is an improvement in terms of recognition of gender equality as a cross-cutting issue, and as a principle that, of course, then ties to all the different components of sustainable development. We do want to highlight that actually it is one of gender equality, or the failure to pay attention to gender equality was actually one of the main failures of the Millennium Development Goals. We also want, and I want to speak specifically to this because sometimes it's never seen as an issue that contributes to gender equality, or gender equality is a means to sustainable development. The issue and the need to strengthen what we already have so that then it addresses the need to reduce and redistribute unpaid care work and realize sexual and reproductive rights, both of which are fundamental to achieving gender equality. And when I speak about the situation of women and girls, I'm talking about women throughout their life cycle and paying attention to the different categories of women and the different ages of women and girls. Two, the issue of human rights has already been highlighted, but I just want to say that for us, it is really important that human rights is paid attention to, and references to human rights need to be added so that then it's not just in specific areas that human rights is mentioned in piecemeal, but just recognizing throughout that human rights and to highlight equality, non-discrimination as key principles that need to guide whatever it is that this agenda needs to be about. If we're talking about transformative sustainable development agenda, it cannot be that if it does not pay attention to some of these principles. And then lastly, actually second last, I want to talk about money, because there is a separate process that happened that, you know, the Addis Ababa outcome and action agenda is out, and some of you might not know about it. But I just want to highlight, for us as a women's meta group, we are emphasizing that it was not just about money. It's not just about money. It's also about the relationship that guide how money flows from where to where, and what relationship that states have or should have that respect the human rights principles that we're talking about, and that respect how the national policies or the environment at the national level would be able to make countries determine what their agenda is and where money is going to go and who it is. And the question of who it is that controls that is a big one, and we can go into discussions around that in detail. And lastly, I just want to say on follow-up and review, and Noeline has touched on this a little bit, and Fabio as well, is that we are also emphasizing how important it is to not just have an enabling environment, but to also recognize, acknowledge, and ensure that there is participation and contribution of civil society, and especially feminist and women's rights organizations. Because the truth be told, we're talking about sustainable development, we're talking about all these different components of it, but women, and especially women human rights defenders, have been at the forefront in not just articulating, but actually implementing the different aspects of what it is that we are working on. So in ending this, I just want to say, if we truly are going to be pushing for this being a transformative agenda, as we say or we support it is, then it's important that we have addressing of discriminatory structural issues that affect women and girls across board. And because this is not just about what affects women and girls only, it is actually things like what Noeline was saying about climate protection. It's things that affect people across board. But we do know that women and girls are further, marginalized when it comes to some of these things. Thank you.
Excellent. Actually, we can pass that on to Roberta. This is Roberta Ferraro, the Indigenous Major Group.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for including us in this press briefing. Just to remind folks that Indigenous peoples, the territories of Indigenous peoples encompass up to 22% of the world's land surface and coincide with areas that hold up to 80% of the world's biodiversity. So we feel that we have a strong stake in this process. We've been saying this from the beginning. And actually, this was affirmed by states in the Rio Plus 20 document, paragraph 49, which actually not only talks about our right to development, but also emphasizes the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Following that, there was a World Conference recently on Indigenous peoples, that also highlights the importance of Indigenous peoples' participation in this process. So with this in mind, taking part in the Open Working Group as an organizing partner, the International Indian Treaty Council, who I'm here representing, one of the oldest, the very first Indigenous NGO that was accredited here at the United Nations in 1977, still going strong today. Our focus was not just be tossed aside or to be just thought of as vulnerable groups, because Indigenous peoples, while they can be vulnerable, are not just in vulnerable groups or marginalized, and our peoples are not just wards of the state, right? We're actually nations, right? And in many cases, there's treaties between colonizing governments and Indigenous peoples' governments to talk about that relationship. So it's a different situation, which is why sometimes we're very adamant on that the term civil society does not include us fully, right? We have a special situation. And so we've been very concerned that our references to Indigenous peoples throughout the Open Working Group and even to now have been appearing and disappearing and reappearing again. We're down to just 2 mentions in the 169 targets. And this is reminiscent of what happened in the MDGs, right? And Indigenous peoples were not mentioned, so the MDGs did not really support what we were trying to do on the ground, and we really wanted to see a difference in this process. There are a few more references now, and at the end of the day, there are a few states now who are coming out and saying, hey, what about the references to Indigenous peoples? So we would like to see those, the few references that we have in the preamble, etc., to be maintained, because yesterday there was some delegations calling for deletion of certain paragraphs that have references to Indigenous peoples. But not only that, but we'd also like to see some additional input of Indigenous peoples, especially in the means of implementation section, and the specific reference highlighting our rights, because there's no mention of rights at all, and that's the key issue for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll get to questions in just a moment. I just wanted a quick introduction to Edith Samani from Children and Youth Major Group.
Thank you. I'm Edith, and I'm with Curious Minds and with Plans for Life, a member of the Hadith Human Rights Coalition. And I just want to tell you a story about myself. So everyone in my small community thought I was lucky to be the first girl in the family to graduate from university because I didn't get pregnant along the way. Because I managed to survive the harsh environment I grew up in as an 11-year-old working in a factory, just to make ends meet. And because I survived despite all of the abuse and threats around me. But I knew it wasn't luck. As a young woman, it is my right to live a life that is free of violation and discrimination, with access to education and health services. Today, I speak not only as a young Ghanaian, but on behalf of the billions of children and young people all over the world. Our future will be determined by the Sustainable Development Goals, but we are also the generation that will make it happen. The goals lead us as much as we also need the goals. These are the actions, therefore, that we need now. We need accountability to people to be the true test of the post-2015 agenda, and the people will judge whether the SDGs are succeeding. And that's why we need legality, mandated, youth-led accountability mechanisms in the monitoring and review process. And I think the whole issue of accountability has been stressed throughout this press briefing. We urgently need to move beyond blind economic growth and are deeply disappointed that much stronger language recognizing planetary boundaries and the need to operate within a safe operating space have still not been taken forward. If we don't recognize that our planets have thresholds and limits, we are fooling ourselves about sustainable development. We are calling for a much greater emphasis on gender equality and sexual and reproductive rights. The health of the world's population cannot be improved without a focus on the sexual and reproductive health of young people, as well as comprehensive sexuality education. I am now 25 years old, and I am a different person with such different needs and perspectives from when I was 15. So I asked myself, why does the data not capture and reflects the reality between my being 25 and my being 15. Leaving no one behind will be impossible without hearing the voices of the most marginalized and without regularly monitoring their situation and amplifying their voices at all levels. That's the global, the regional, and the national levels. So only with these changes included in the SDGs can this be made promise, and this kind of promise be made worth making. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, now we will open up to the floor. Just to let you know, we do have representatives here from trade unions and workers, persons with disabilities, NGOs. So we will represent here if you want to direct your questions to the group specifically. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Greg Scruggs with Cityscope, a media outlet focused on the run-up to Habitat 3. So we are interested in the SDGs from the urban perspective, specifically looking at goal 11. And in light of the fact that a majority of the world's population lives in cities, I would open this to any of the representatives to comment on the importance of urbanization as a cross-cutting issue among the SDGs and the relative importance of cities and human settlements in the outcome document. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone from the groups and the stakeholders who would like to respond? Sadia?
Hi, my name is Eleanor Blomstrom from the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and I'm one of the OPs for the Women's Major Group. I think it's a really important question, and as we approached the goals from such gender equality, of course, it's cross-cutting, as has been clear, and therefore for us it was really important to think about how does gender equality come into the sustainable cities and human settlements, and then vice versa, how does that come into the other goals. And I think that if you're looking at issues of water, if you're looking at issues of food and agriculture, gender equality, all of it has to do with how you're designing and developing the city. So it's not only the policies themselves and what you're seeing take place, but it's who is participating in those policies and who is developing them. And so I think it's really important across the board, and I haven't heard much about it, honestly, in our major groups and other stakeholders meetings here, so I'd be interested to hear what else Savio has to say, but I think there may be a role in the follow-up and review in terms of accountability as well, in terms of the role of cities and settlements.
Thank you. I just want to add, like we've learned a lot from the MDGs, where because of this entire pressure on urbanization and slums, we have seen a lot of people evicted. Thousands of millions actually, and this is documented some of these cases. And besides that, we also need to ensure that the SDGs give tenure, so the right to tenure. I think that's really important, because if you have no tenure, you don't have an identity, you don't have a ration card, you don't have like a voting card, you're nobody. And that, you start from like being nobody. And I think if there's pressure on urbanization and you then sort of put people in a box and you don't even recognize that they exist, or you forcefully evict them, you are actually violating people's rights, just the right to sort of survive, the right to live, and also enjoyment of other rights, like right to water. People can't get a water connection because they don't have an identity. And a lot of people are never ever counted. They're never brought into the census, so they don't even enjoy facilities or budgetary allocations. So you can go down a route where you could actually violate people's rights because of this pressure of having more cities, better cities, and actually displacing people who only live in cities.
Just very briefly, I'll continue by saying it's also a gender equality and human rights issue because it's about the right to access land. And that also then links to issues such as food security and food sovereignty. If you're living in a very big city in an informal settlement and you're trying to feed yourself and your family and your community, it's incredibly important that we think through the rights as vitally interconnected. The right to safe housing, the right to water, the right to sanitation, and what we're seeing, the reason why we is always talking about the political economy and about the right to development is because when you have large corporations, you then are developing quote unquote cities, and you're leaving so many people behind because they don't have the, the capacity to live full and meaningful and safe life. For us, that's absolutely integral to the post-2015 program.
Yes, hi. I'm Jude Kuryansky, and I represent the International Association of Applied Psychology and the Psychology Coalition of NGOs here at the UN. And I'm so glad you asked this question because I just wrote an article for a book that's coming out in 6 weeks on eco-psychology and the intersection of environmental protection. And I reviewed the literature about what's called E, which is pro-social environmental behavior. And basically, so much of the literature shows that when people have what's called a cosmopolitan identity, an identity to or place attachment is another one of these psychological phrases for it, that they become healthier psychologically, physically, they get over diseases faster, and they take better care of their particular place or environment. In other words, they pick up their garbage, they don't litter as much. So some of the research has shown that by creating more green spaces, this is what you would imagine, that people will rate themselves as happier. That by creating walkways that go through different neighborhoods, that people become more affiliated with their neighbors. So this to me is a very exciting issue that relates to the current agenda.
Thanks very much. We should move on and see if anyone has any questions. This could also be an opportunity for us as the press, how we might be going about that.
Mr. Lee from People's Daily. I understand there are so many good ideas from various groups, but how can you unify them together to put them in the documents post-2015 agenda? And how would you make the voice heard during the gender segment?
That's the critical question. Does anyone want to take it on?
We are very pleased that you asked the question. I'm very pleased because what it is really about also is about participation of civil society in all our diversity within these incredibly important negotiations. For us, that means also that we need to be very much in there in the text. So we can't just say, civil society will participate without mandating how that will occur. And that is about accountability. What I can say is that civil society has already worked incredibly hard. Major groups and other stakeholders have worked incredibly hard over years to ensure that this is the final negotiation. But we've been here all the way through 13 open working groups and in every space that we can. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult because what I would say is also for those who are working for the economic south, it's incredibly hard. It takes resources and you have to. That's why the movement building aspect of this work is very important. And it's important for states to recognize how much it takes for civil society and communities to have direct voice within these post-2015 development agenda that after all is supposedly the agenda of all and for.
Yeah.
Since the SDG negotiations began years ago, civil society organizations have been making several demands: right to water, right to sanitation, gender empowerment. How much of these demands are included in the SDGs, or were they all an exercise in futility?
I think we would like to give credit where it's due. So there has been, I think the SDGs are a decent document. There is quite a few of those sort of rights mentioned, and from where we started to where we have ended, I think we give some member states a credit for really pushing some of the agenda. But they still become empty, mere words. They are text. And unless those words have an accountable framework to it and attached to it, and governments, not governments, communities can hold their governments to account, saying, by the way, you promised this, it is a political declaration, it is not legally binding, but as a citizen or as a person, as a living on your territory, I'm going to hold you to account for it. I'm going to say, you made this promise, where is the delivery? I think unless you attach that to these goals, to these targets, this is like just, for want of a better word, a love letter. I promise you all this, and I will, and when we come to 2030 and we are where we have started. So so it's better than what we expected, but it should not undermine existing human rights standards and obligations. There is a danger that when you caveat it with saying that, and in line with national sovereignty and in line with capacity, you then distract the agenda by, and you remind them, saying, by the way, these are your international obligations. You are legally bound to some of these things. So it's not that you have a getaway clause here. So that's just in response to your statement. And from the previous speaker on the General Assembly, I think the General Assembly is a bit too late if you're quoting the September part of it. For us as civil society, the real sort of push is for the next 48 to 72 hours that member says, listen to all that we are saying as civil society. They've heard some of it, but sometimes it falls on a deaf ear, and we really want them to say, we have been saying this for 12, 14, 15 months now. It's costly for civil society to bring people from across the world to New York. It's time consuming, it takes a lot of energy, but we have said it, we've put our investment in it. We now want to see dividends, and we'll only see dividends in the next 48 hours, 72 hours, when we see the text and say, yes, we will have a report card at that moment. So I would say that rather than General Assembly for the next 48 to 72 hours, let's put all the energy to get what we want. Matt, you have any questions?
Good afternoon. It's fun that. My name is Matt Simons from the Workers and Trade Unions Organization, International Trade Union Confederation. I think if you asked the majority of major groups and other stakeholders, I think we're pretty well satisfied with the level of ambition that's contained in the post-2015 framework. But as I think nearly all the panelists have highlighted, what's missing is the accountability. So the enforceability of what's in this post-2015 framework. And it becomes particularly pronounced when you set it against other international agreements that don't necessarily perhaps share the same objectives or ambitions. So if you look at what's happening right now in sort of is what's really missing at this point.
Thank you. My name is Alessandra Guilherme from ABONC, Brazilian Association of NGOs in Brazil, and focal point for the Beyond 2015 campaign. I think that one important thing of this part of this debate is how we will translate what governments will commit here to the communities, because just following what Sally just said, the only way to make our governments accountable is really to do that at the national level. So despite the fact that we are not have been able to bring everybody here to New York to follow up the process and making sure that our common asks will be listened by the governments, I think we have been doing, many of us, I think most of us, a lot of work to really take this discussion at the national level. So Beyond 2015, for instance, is working in more than 130 countries. We have almost 1,050, 500 organizations that are members of the campaign. But there are 2 years that we are talking about implementation at the national level. In many countries, discussions about indicators, how the indicators be translated, and how civil society is participating in the process has been now moving forward. I think the other important point for us, and especially for the media, and that's why we are so interested in bringing media here, is that I think we are all agreed that we are talking about old issues here. There is nothing new, right? But the new thing is that we are bringing all these issues, all of them together at the same time, to an agenda that could be transformative if implemented with the accountability framework that is necessary to do that. And then there will be also no transformative agenda without the means of implementation. And then I think that some of us that came out from Addis Ababa, last week, 2 weeks ago, we were really disappointed because no additional funding was committed to this agenda that was supposed to mobilize around $4 or $3 or $6 trillion per year, right? So the issues that we have been seeing here in terms of the role of private sector without any kind of binding accountability to the human rights framework, the role that government should play, because what we have been seeing is also that governments are stepping back on their role in terms of providing the means for civil society to access the services we need. So all these discussions are still on, and that's why we brought this, I think, this press conference to say that we need to have this new parameter, this new framework, because otherwise we're not succeeding in implementing these goals. Another structural issue also is the question of civil society participation at all levels in the process and in the implementation. There is now a proposal within this text that is more strong for civil society participation, also allowing us to be invited to provide a report to the follow-up of the SDG. I think this is something very crucial for us because this is the only way we can also as our governments to fulfill their commitments. So I think these are the type of points that we really need to media to pay attention. And the last point, if I may, is the question of multilateralism. We have been talking about that many times. What happened in Addis was just an example of how weak is the multilateralism discussion now. Because we have aligned ourselves, for instance, for gender. For gender issue, of course, European countries and other developed countries are very hard in pushing our sexual reproductive rights agenda, human rights, etc., etc. But they have been very weak in terms of providing the means and the funds and transferring technology and open intellectual property and so on. So what does it mean, right? And what we saw in Addis was also the huge push from developed countries, the rich countries, undermining the desire of developed countries to access. So there was not a good faith negotiation in Addis. So what we do not want to see here is that repetition of what happened in Addis. And we are trusting our co-facilitators and governments that here we can advance a little bit more. Because in fact, I think that there will be no sustainable development without the means of implementation and without the revision of this North and South cooperation and process. ODA will never be enough. We need to have other, including tapping on financial systems, progressive taxation, etc. So these issues are still on. And we need to have and to get support from the media to highlight what are the key issues that we have on the table.
Thank you. On this point on media engagement, is there any further comments or questions?
So in my comments, so just a quick remark on that, chiming in with my colleagues here. Accountability is also all about data. What else should it be? So without data, we will not be able to see ever if the sustainable development goals are actually successful. So linking that to accountability, we need to have citizen review generated and backed data. That's crucial, otherwise there will be no accountability in the SDGs. On the other hand, governments need to make available the data they create, and it needs to be user-friendly and accessible, especially for young people who are very keen to use social media and to put in place accountability mechanisms that way. What are we going to do with the data we have then? We can follow the money that's crucial, although we heard that there will be not as much money as we had hoped for. Still, we need to be able to follow the money, to have accountability mechanisms that enable us to see if government services are indeed not leaving anyone behind, and so on. Without data, this will be nothing. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have the room for another 5 minutes or so. So any last questions from the media? Yes.
I wanted to ask about means of implementation and financing, because obviously all of the things that Alice was quite interesting, so I know you're pointing that. Yes, from civil society perspective, what are the most important forms of funding? So is it public, private, international funding? Because obviously everyone I guess they're hearing different sides of whether it's private funding.
I'll just say very quickly and then maybe pass to someone else. I mean, for us, it's not just about the amount of money. It's about honoring existing commitments to early aid is one thing. We're not even at the level where that's happening. We've heard in the room today, those from the least developed countries and others who are speaking about that. So it's one about existing commitments, honoring existing commitments. But it's also about, the problem at Addis was a failure. What it starts to do is it marketizes development. It continues the process of marketization of development. And that means that it relies on voluntary or on private sector contributions. And that leads to less accountability as well. So for us, it is about public sector contribution. It's about the status duty bearer. And it's about a social contract between governments and their peoples. So I think one of the things that I think is really useful when we're talking about this question, the gender and how important it is not just to keep talking about the laundry list of issues, but to look at the political economy, about the power and the resources and our conversations, whoever we are, whether we're governments or civil society or press, and how we deal with the structural issues. So one of the last thing I said before I pass it on is, what we saw happen in Addis, I think, for some of us, was it was a failure to challenge. There's been juridical kind of, agreements that have been passed by states to institute, to promote and protect transnational corporations. But we haven't seen the same in terms of protection of human rights against what is happening by transnational corporations. So for us, it's about this widening gap between what we need as the people in order to be safe and the ability for private sector to have a very, very deep input into post-2015 development agenda processes. So that's what I'd say is it's very easy for us to do these, very short inputs, but it's about the political economy of post-2015 development agenda. And that takes a much longer interview type situation than sitting in a room like that. So that's how I think that.
Thank you. I think this is an excellent question. And just to follow up on what Navi was saying, I think what we need is a combination of all of this, because ODA is not enough. The gap is 1 trillion. We are talking about an agenda of $6 trillion per year. ODA is voluntary yet, right? So we need to have legal back, we need to have a predictable fund. And one of the ways to get predictable fund, and also to tap on the issues of economic framework, for instance, is to look at the financial markets. Only the currency today, it's moving $1 trillion per day. If you put a tax on that, it would raise enough money to sustain this agenda. So derivatives, you can raise $8 billion per year with a tax of 0.5% only on derivatives. So we know what to do, and we know how to do. And the point is, again, the political will to change the system. The other thing is the emphasis of this current document on the domestic funds, which is linked to the previous discussion about the North-South relation and the way the governments from the North still are pushing to keep us dependent on that. So when you take a look at the domestic funds, most of developing and developed countries are, they cannot pay more because they have debts, external debts and internal debts that are so huge
For instance, Brazil, half of our national budget is going to pay that, half. And every time the government puts any kind of package outside, it's to cut on services for public, for people. The same that is happening in England, because the model of IMF, World Bank, etc., is pushing for that old economic ideas that needs to be changed. So this is about this transformative agenda. How can you transform the world without transforming the economic system? So that's why we are campaigning for economic democracy. It is time to talk about economic democracy. We cannot go any longer just repeating what we know cannot be done.
Thanks very much. We've just got a number, so.
Okay, yeah, very quickly, I just wanted to talk about how important it was for the government commitment, from a clear example from Ghana, because this is what happened when youth advocates decided to do a review of the budget. And you know the budget can be a very technical thing, and capacity building is one thing, and we were able to review the budget, and after a long sitting and talking about what is in the budget, we realized that a majority of a percentage of the budget has gone into public service emoluments and paying public servants, and the real issues, the education, the health, and the gender, all of those things had very little percentage commitment from government. And even within that, what happened is that government commits 2%, and then the other 98% is for some assumed, they are hoping that some development partners will put some money in there. So if the money doesn't come by the end of the year, it means that there is no implementation. That is the reason why we are calling for a stronger political will and some sort of commitment, especially from the duty bearers, from government, so that we know that, even if development partners decided not to give us anything for a whole year, we know that our government really, really want to do this for us.
Thanks very much. We're almost out of time, it's 3 o'clock. I'm going to send everyone the details in this briefing note to you. I'm going to act as a general point of contact for general inquiries. That I've also included in this press contacts for quite a number of the major groups and other stakeholders. So if you have particular questions for those groups, we can be in touch. And for more specific national level stories, they will be able to triage and put you in the right direction with great press colleagues of ours who have stories from the ground, these great themes and putting into practice. So we want to build on those connections over the next couple of months leading up to September. And again, I think we will hope to reconvene then and give you another briefing and see how things stand in September and how things are looking forward. So thanks again. Thank you so much for attending. It's been great to talk with you all, and we'll be following up with you very soon.